There's an old saying in the West that the deadliest snake is the one you never see coming. In the dust-worn town of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, circa 1875, that wisdom had never rung more true. For while the town had its share of notorious characters, Rattlesnake Joe Wilson, the McCullough twins with their matching pearl-handled revolvers, and that quiet killer they called Smoke, none sparked more whispered conversations than Sarah Silken Shot Bennett, though most folks didn't know her by that name. To them, she was just Miss Sarah, the seamstress who worked out of that modest shop with its sun-faded blue door on the east end of Main Street. Her hands could work magic with fabric, they'd say, watching her stitch delicate patterns into wedding dresses or men-torn dungarees with invisible seams. What they didn't know was that those same steady hands had notched 23 kills across 4 territories, each one cleaner than the last. The delicate needlework that earned her daily bread employed the same precision she'd once used to put a bullet through Black Jack Martinez's eye at 50 paces in the New Mexico territory. Sheriff Thomas Reed knew, of course. He'd recognized her the moment she rode into town 2 years ago, her face hidden beneath a neat bonnet, a Winchester rifle case disguised as a bolt of fabric strapped to her saddle. But he was a man who understood the value of second chances, and more importantly, he understood the worth of having someone like her in town, even if she claimed those days were behind her. Folks deserve a chance to start fresh, he'd told his deputy when Sarah first arrived, and sometimes the best shield is the one nobody knows exists. The illusion of peace in Copper Creek had held steady until the Thorn gang rode in one scorching afternoon in late August. 6 men with cold eyes and colder hearts, led by the infamous Clay Thorn himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty preceded him like thunder before a storm. They'd robbed 3 banks in the past month, leaving a trail of bodies and burning buildings in their wake. The gang took up residence in the Golden Spur Saloon, throwing their weight around like they owned the place. It didn't take long for them to notice the neat little shop with its blue door, or the slender woman with auburn hair who worked there with such quiet concentration. It was young Billy Thorne, Clay's hot-headed brother, who first pushed through her shop door, letting it bang against the wall as he swaggered in. The bell above chimed softly, an incongruously gentle sound against his heavy bootfalls. Sarah didn't look up from her work, her needle moving in and out of the fine silk she was embroidering with mechanical precision. "Well, well," Billy drawled, running a finger along a shelf of fabric bolts, leaving a trail in the dust. "Ain't you a pretty little thing to be all alone in such a rough town?" Sarah's needle never paused. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Thorne? A torn shirt, perhaps? Or is there someone in your gang who needs proper mourning clothes?" The subtle threat in her words sailed right past Billy's comprehension. He leaned on her counter, his unwashed smell intruding on her carefully ordered space. "Might be I need a new shirt. Might be I need something else entirely." Finally, Sarah looked up, and for just a moment something flickered in her green eyes that would have sent wiser men running. But Billy Thorne had never been accused of wisdom, and he missed the warning signs completely. The way her right hand had slipped beneath the counter, the slight shift in her posture that any experienced gunfighter would have recognized as a prelude to violence. The bell chimed again as Clay Thorne himself entered the shop, his spurs singing against the wooden floor. Unlike his brother, Clay noticed things. He noticed the way Sarah's shoulders set, the almost imperceptible tension in her neck. But most importantly, he noticed the calluses on her right hand, calluses that didn't come from working with needle and thread. "Come on, little brother," Clay said, his voice carrying the dry rasp of trail dust. "Let the lady work. We've got business to discuss." As they left, Sarah's needle resumed its steady rhythm, but her eyes followed them through the window, watching. As they crossed the street to the saloon, In the fading afternoon light, her shadow stretched across the floor like a reaching hand, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was coming to Copper Creek, and soon the Thorn gang would learn why some snakes are best left undisturbed. Sheriff Thomas Reed sat in his office that evening, watching the Thorn gang through his window as they swaggered between the saloon and the general store. The lamplight caught the silver star on his chest, casting star-shaped shadows on the weathered desk where a telegram lay open. Thorn gang headed your way. 3 dead in Silver Springs, 2 banks emptied, no witnesses left alive. He thought back to the day Sarah Bennett had first arrived in Copper Creek. She'd walked into his office, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and laid her cards on the table. "You'll have heard of Silken Shot," she'd said without preamble. "I'm looking to leave that name behind." Reed had heard the stories all right. The woman who'd cleaned up Dodge City without firing a single shot in public view. The mysterious figure who'd taken down the entire Carson family in their own home, leaving nothing but cooling bodies and perfectly placed bullet holes. Some said she'd learned her craft from her father, a Confederate sharpshooter who taught her to shoot before she could write her name. Others claimed she'd been trained by the Apaches after her family was killed. The truth, Reed suspected, lay somewhere in between. Across the street, Sarah's shop light still burned despite the late hour. Through the window he could see her working on what appeared to be a wedding dress, though her movements seemed more purposeful than usual. Reed knew she was taking stock of her arsenal, guns hidden in hollow walls, ammunition stored in fabric bolts, throwing knives concealed in dress forms. The door to his office creaked open, and Deputy Mike Wilson stepped in, his young face tight with concern. "Sheriff, they're drinking heavy at the Golden Spur. Billy Thorne's running his mouth about the seamstress, says he's going to pay her another visit tonight." Reed's hand unconsciously moved to his gun. "Miss Sarah can handle herself." "That's what worries me," Wilson replied, lowering his voice. "I saw Clay Thorne watching her shop earlier. He had that look, Sheriff, the same look a wolf gets when it spots something unusual in its territory." In her shop, Sarah was making her own preparations. Behind the elegant wedding dress she was supposedly working on, her fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned her favorite Colt, a weapon as familiar to her hands as any needle or thread. The gun had been a gift from her father, along with the lessons that had kept her alive all these years. A lady should know 2 things, he'd told her, how to look harmless and how to be deadly. She'd learned both lessons well. Through her window, she watched Clay Thorne emerge from the saloon, his brother and 2 other gang members in tow. Their shadows stretched long in the dying light, like dark fingers reaching across the street. Clay paused, turning to look directly at her shop, and their eyes met through the glass. A slight smile curved his lips, and Sarah knew he was putting the pieces together. The bell above her door chimed softly as Mrs. Eleanor Turner, the banker's wife, hurried in clutching a torn shawl. "Miss Sarah, I'm sorry it's so late, but I was hoping—" Her voice trailed off as she noticed the tension in Sarah's posture. "Best head home, Mrs. Turner," Sarah said softly, her eyes never leaving the window. "And I'd suggest staying there until further notice. Might be some excitement in town tonight." Eleanor Turner had lived in the West long enough to recognize the weight in those words. She hurried out, casting fearful glances at the gang members across the street. As she left, Sarah began methodically closing up shop, her movements unhurried but deliberate. She extinguished the front lamps, but left a single light burning in the back room, an invitation or a trap, depending on one's perspective. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the boardwalk like distant gunfire. Thunder rolled closer, and in the gathering darkness, Clay Thorne gathered his men for a quiet conversation, their faces illuminated briefly by matches as they lit their cigarettes. Sarah's hands moved steadily, switching from needlework to gunwork. with practiced ease. The storm was about to break over Copper Creek, and with it would come violence as precise as any stitch she'd ever sewn. The rain intensified as night settled over Copper Creek, drumming against tin roofs and turning the main street into a river of mud. In the Golden Spur, Billy Thorne's voice rose above the storm, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. "That seamstress, she's got an attitude needs adjusting," he slurred, spinning his gun on the scarred table. "Women round here need to learn respect." Clay Thorne watched his brother with cold calculation, noting how the other patrons had gradually moved away from their table like prey sensing a predator. But it wasn't his brother's drunken threats that occupied his thoughts. It was the memory of those calluses on the seamstress's hands and the way she'd moved when he entered her shop. Fluid, balanced, ready. "Jenkins," he called to one of his men, a former cavalry scout with sharp eyes. "What do you make of our little seamstress?" Jenkins took a slow pull from his cigarette before answering. "Something ain't right about her, boss. Way she holds herself. Saw her carrying water buckets this morning. Moved like a cat, no wasted motion. And them windows in her shop." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're spotless, clean enough to shoot through." At her shop, Sarah worked in the back room, her movements as measured as Jenkins had observed. She'd changed from her day dress into darker clothes, practical gear hidden beneath a modest shawl. As she worked, she recalled another rainy night, years ago in Colorado Territory, when she'd learned the value of patience and preparation. She'd been tracking the McCullough brothers, hired guns who'd murdered a family of settlers. For 3 days, she'd posed as a traveling dressmaker, taking measurements and noting their habits. On the 4th night, she'd sewn their death shrouds before they ever knew they needed them. The local paper had called it a miracle. 3 killers found dead in their beds, each with a single shot through the heart. Only the undertaker had noticed the pristine needlework on their burial clothes. A floorboard creaked near her front door, pulling her from the memory. Sarah's hand moved to her Colt, but it was only Sheriff Reed, water dripping from his hat brim. "Thorns, got men watching your shop," he said without preamble. 2 in the alley behind Turner's store, another across the street by the blacksmith's. Sarah nodded, continuing to organize spools of thread that on closer inspection were actually arranged to mark firing lanes through her windows. "Billy Thorne's going to do something stupid tonight," she replied softly. "His brother's hoping for it." "Clay Thorne's no fool," Reed warned. "He's figured something out." "Good." Sarah's green eyes held a dangerous glint in the lamplight. "Then he'll understand what's happening when it starts." The sheriff studied her face, seeing not the quiet seamstress, but the gunfighter he'd first met years ago. "Town's behind you, Sarah. Dr. Matthews has his surgery ready, and folks are staying inside tonight. Even old man Wilson at the livery says his horses are too sick to rent. Made sure Thorne's men can't get fresh mounts if they need them." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. In 2 years, she'd sewn herself into the fabric of this town, stitch by stitch, creating something worth protecting. Her fingers traced the pattern of a half-finished dress on her workbench, a wedding dress for young Lucy Matthews, the doctor's daughter. "Thank you, Thomas," she said quietly. "But when it's done, there can't be any official questions." "The seamstress needs to remain just that," Reed nodded gravely. "Far as anyone will know, it was just another tragic case of outlaws meeting bad luck in bad weather." He turned to leave, then paused. "Watch yourself with Clay. Man's got a reputation for seeing through deceptions." "So did Black Jack Martinez," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that deadly whisper she'd become famous for. "Right up until he didn't see anything at all." As the sheriff's footsteps faded into the rain, Sarah heard Billy Thorne's drunken voice, approaching from the saloon. The fool was singing now, an old trail song twisted into something crude. Behind him, she caught glimpses of his gang spreading out, taking positions they thought were subtle. Sarah extinguished her lamp and moved into the shadows. The streets of Copper Creek were about to learn why the name Silken Shot had once made even hardened killers check their locks at night. Billy Thorne stumbled through the rain toward the seamstress's shop, his boots splashing in puddles that reflected the few remaining lit windows of Copper Creek. Behind him, two of his gang members, Hank Rawlins and Pete McCain, exchanged nervous glances. They'd seen that look in Billy's eyes before, the one that usually ended with someone dead and Clay having to move the gang to new territory. Inside her shop, Sarah moved like a shadow through her carefully arranged workspace. The dress forms, usually stationed around the room displaying her latest work, had been repositioned to create subtle barriers. Each one marked a calculated distance, every space between them measured as precisely as the seams she sewed. The first warning came as a whisper of boot leather on her front porch. Sarah's fingers traced the grip of her Colt, feeling the familiar patterns she'd carved there, delicate scrollwork that most mistook for decoration rather than the kill markers. They were. Through the rain-streaked window, she counted shadows. Billy in front, two more flanking, and there, in the alley across the street, Clay Thorne himself, watching. The door burst open with a crash that sent the bell chiming wildly. Billy. Thorne stood swaying in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat, gun already drawn. "Evening, Miss Seamstress," he slurred, trying to peer into the darkness of the shop. "Thought we might continue our conversation from earlier." Sarah's voice came from somewhere in the shadows, soft as silk sliding over steel. "Mr. Thorne, I'm afraid I'm closed for the evening, though I do have something specially measured for you." Hank and Pete spread out, trying to flank the darkness where her voice originated. They were professionals, moving with the careful coordination of men used to violence. But Sarah had positioned her dress forms precisely for this moment. And in the darkness, the man-shaped silhouettes played tricks with depth and distance. "Ain't here for no measuring," Billy growled, his temper rising at her calm tone. "Here to teach you some respect." He fired a shot into one of the dress forms, sending stuffing and fabric flying. The sound echoed like thunder in the confined space. Sarah's laugh, when it came, held no mirth. "Poor choice, Mr. Thorne. That was Mrs. Henderson's Sunday dress you just ruined. I'll have to add it to your bill." Billy fired again, hitting another dress form. "Show yourself." "As you wish." The words came from behind him. What happened next would be whispered about in saloons across 3 territories. Billy Thorne spun, firing wildly, but Sarah was already moving. Her first shot took Hank Rawlins in the shoulder, a wounding shot designed to create chaos. Her second caught Pete McCain's gun hand, sending his weapon clattering across the floor. Billy got off. 2 more shots, both going wide as Sarah seemed to flow between the dress forms like water between rocks. One moment she was a shadow by the counter, the next a glimpse of movement near the window. The gang members, used to straight-up gunfights in the street, found themselves shooting at phantoms. Outside, Clay Thorne watched the flashes of gunfire. Through the windows, his face twisted in a grimace of recognition. He'd seen this dance before, years ago in New Mexico. The precision of it, the way the shots came from impossible angles. It all spoke of one person. Inside, Sarah had worked, her way behind Billy, who was now spinning in desperate circles, his gun clicking empty. "Who are you?" he gasped, fumbling with his reload. "Just a seamstress," Sarah replied softly, "measuring you for your coffin." Before Billy could turn, the butt of Sarah's Colt struck him precisely at the base of his skull, dropping him unconscious. To the floor, Pete McCain, cradling his shattered hand, back toward the door. Hank had already fled into the rain, leaving a trail of blood that would later be washed away by the storm. Sarah stood in the center of her shop, gun still raised. dress forms torn and leaking, stuffing around her like fallen soldiers. Through the broken door, she locked eyes with Clay Thorne across the street. For a moment, neither moved. Then Clay touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respect or warning, turned, and vanished into the rain-soaked darkness. The Sar's first round had gone to the Seamstress, but Sarah knew Clay Thorne well enough by reputation to know this was just the beginning. The real storm hadn't even arrived yet. The aftermath of the shooting settled over the shop like dust after a storm. Dr. Matthews arrived first, his medical bag clutched against his chest as he hurried through the rain. He found Sarah calmly binding Billy Thorne's unconscious form. With strips of muslin torn from a ruined dress, her knots as precise as surgical stitches. "Just like old times, Sarah," the doctor muttered, kneeling to check Billy's pulse. He was one of the few who knew her past, having patched up both her victims and herself over the years. "Though you seem to have been gentler with these ones than usual." "The night's still young," Sarah replied, securing the last knot, "and Clay Thorne's still out there. These were just the opening stitches in a longer pattern." She moved to the window, watching the rain-slicked street where deputies were already gathering under Sheriff Reed's direction. The doctor worked quickly, checking Billy's head wound. "Young fool's got a hard skull. He'll live to regret this night." He paused, glancing at the destroyed shop. "You know Clay won't let this stand, not with his brother trussed up like a turkey for Sunday dinner." Sarah began collecting spent shell casings with methodical precision, dropping them into her sewing basket alongside spools of thread. "Count on it. Clay's already figured out who I am. Saw it in his eyes when he was watching from across the street." The bell above the door chimed softly as Sheriff Reed entered, water streaming from his coat. "Pete McCain's over at the jail," he reported. "Rawlins left a blood trail heading east, but this rain'll wash it away soon enough." He surveyed the damage, noting the precise placement of the bullet holes. "Didn't take you for one to show mercy." "Sarah, not mercy," she corrected, running her fingers along a bullet hole in one of her dress forms. "Calculation. Clay Thorne's a strategist. He'll respect precision more than brutality. Tonight was about sending a message." As if summoned by her words, a piece of paper slid under the door, carried by the wind. Reed retrieved it, his face darkening. As he read, "It's from Clay. Says he wants to meet, just you and him at dawn out by Cottonwood Creek." "Classic Clay Thorne," came a new voice. Samuel Smoke. Martinez stepped out of the shadows near the back door, making everyone but Sarah jump. The legendary scout's presence was another piece of evidence that this night had been long planned. He did the same thing in Tombstone last year, called for a parley, had his men set up an ambush, left 4 marshals in shallow graves. Sarah nodded to her old friend, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Good to see you got my message, Smoke." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, moving to study the bullet holes in the walls. "Though you seem to have started the dance without me." "Just warming up," Sarah said, returning to her workbench. She opened a hidden compartment, revealing not spools of thread, but ammunition and gun oil. "Clay's hoping I'll walk into his trap tomorrow. He doesn't know about the patterns we've sown around this town over the past 2 years." Reed and Matthews exchanged glances. They'd watched Sarah slowly transform Copper Creek, placing trusted allies in key positions, establishing escape routes and safe houses, all under the guise of her seamstress work. Every delivery of fabric had been a chance to map the town's defensive positions. Every social call, an opportunity to coordinate with supporters. "What about your cover?" Reed asked. "After tonight." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "A seamstress who got lucky against drunk outlaws. That's all anyone outside this room needs to know." She checked her Colt with practiced efficiency. "By tomorrow night, Clay Thorne will either be dead or gone, and I'll go back to my needlework like none of this ever happened." Smoke lit a cigarette, the match flame briefly illuminating his scarred face. You always did have a gift for appearances, Sarah. Guess that's why they never see you coming until it's too late. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the blood and gun smoke. In the Golden Spur, Clay Thorne gathered his remaining men, his cold eyes focused on the strategy taking shape in his mind. Dawn was coming to Copper Creek, and with it, a reckoning that would test whether a seamstress's precision could overcome an outlaw's cunning. Clay Thorne sat in the back room of the Golden Spur, a half-empty bottle of whiskey untouched before him. The lamp's flame cast his shadow long against the wall as he studied a crude map of Copper Creek drawn on the table. Around him, his remaining men waited in tense silence, nursing wounds to both flesh and pride. Silken Shot, he mused, tracing the route from the saloon to the seamstress's shop. Been hearing stories about her for years. Never thought she'd be hiding behind a sewing needle. He looked up at Jenkins, who was still favoring his left side after their hasty retreat. Tell me again what you saw. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. She moved like water, boss. No wasted motion. Every shot placed just so, wounding shots, not killing, like she was sending a message. He paused, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. Reminded me of that business in Santa Fe, when you told us about the Carson family getting took out in their sleep. Clay nodded slowly. The Carson job had been legendary. An entire family of killers eliminated in one night, each with a single shot through the heart. No one had ever claimed responsibility, but there'd been rumors about a woman's boot prints in the dust. She's been planning this, he said finally, setting up her shot for 2 years. Should we cut our losses? Asked Miguel, the gang's youngest member. Plenty of other towns, other banks. Clay's hand slammed the table hard enough to make the lamp flame jump. My brother's in their jail. Nobody takes what's mine. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Besides, you don't understand what we've stumbled into. This isn't just about Billy or the bank. We found something rare, a legend trying to disappear. He stood, moving to the window where he could see Sarah's shop in the distance, a single lamp still burning despite the late hour. You know what makes her dangerous? It's not the shooting, it's the patience. Every stitch in this town is part of her web. Every friendly greeting, every hemmed dress. She's been weaving a trap, and we walked right into it. From the street came the sound of horses. Sheriff Reed's deputies making their rounds. Clay watched them pass, noting their movements were too precise for simple townsmen. She's got help, professional help. That scout who slipped into her shop, that was Smoke Martinez. Recognized his walk. The name sent a ripple of unease through the room. Smoke's reputation as a tracker was matched only by his skill with a knife. If he was involved, this game had more players than they'd counted. What about the dawn meeting? Jenkins asked. She won't come alone. Clay's thin smile held no warmth, counting on it. While she's watching for an ambush at Cottonwood Creek, we'll hit the town from 3 directions. Fire in the livery stable first. That'll draw attention east. Then the gunpowder we cached under the church goes up. In the chaos, he traced a line on the map to the jail. We get Billy out. And the seamstress, Miguel asked. Leave her to me. Clay pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time. She's good. Maybe the best I've ever seen. But she's got one weakness. He tapped the map where Sarah's shop stood. She cares about this place, these people. 2 years of playing seamstress wasn't all an act. She'll try to protect them, and that's when we'll have her. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and the air heavy with moisture. Clay could smell gunpowder and promise on the wind. Send word to our men in the hills. I want them in position before first light, and find out who else she's got helping her. No one's this good without friends. As his men filed out, Clay remained at the window, studying the distant glow of Sarah's lamp. In his mind, he could see her preparing, checking weapons, planning angles. It was like looking in a mirror. two strategists moving pieces on a board that encompassed all of Copper Creek. "Sleep well, Silken Shot," he whispered to the darkness. "Tomorrow we'll see who's really been hiding behind that needle of yours." In her shop, as if hearing his thoughts, Sarah extinguished her lamp. The sudden darkness felt like a challenge or a promise. Dawn was coming to Copper Creek, and with it, a game of shadows where every stitch could mean the difference between victory and a shallow grave. In the hours before dawn, Copper Creek held its breath. The rain had left behind a heavy mist that clung to the streets like a burial shroud, turning lamplight into ghostly halos. In her shop, Sarah sat at her workbench, fingers moving with practiced precision, not over fabric this time, but across the disassembled pieces of her weapons. "You're sure about the church?" Smoke asked from his position by the window, where he'd been watching the streets with a scout's trained eye. "Seems a mighty sacred place for Clay Thorne to cache his gunpowder. He'll use it precisely because it seems unlikely," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen his work before. In Wyoming, he used a schoolhouse to hide his men. In Kansas, it was a doctor's office." Her hands never stopped moving as she spoke. "Clay understands that the best ambush comes from where you least expect it." Across town, Eleanor Turner slipped through her back door, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. To any watching eyes, she was simply a housewife preparing for an early morning. But beneath the cloth, nestled among fresh biscuits, lay ammunition and medical supplies, part of Sarah's carefully orchestrated preparation. In the jail, Sheriff Reed sat with Billy Thorne, who had finally regained consciousness. The young outlaw glared through the bars, his bravado somewhat diminished by the knot on his head. "Your brother's going to try something stupid," Reed said conversationally, checking the loads in his shotgun. "Lot of folks likely to get hurt," Billy spat on the floor. "Clay's gonna kill that seamstress real slow, then he's gonna burn this town to the ground." Reed's smile held no warmth. "Son, you still don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Ask yourself why a woman like that chose this town, why she spent 2 years sewing herself into its fabric. Look around. Every window gives her a clear shot. Every alley's got 2 ways out. This whole place is her web." In the shadows behind the livery stable, Jenkins and 2 other Thorne gang members were positioning oil-soaked rags, unaware that Dr. Matthews's young son was watching from his bedroom window above. The boy carefully counted the men and their locations, just as Miss Sarah had taught him during his weekly reading lessons. Sarah stood, moving to check her own preparations. Every dress form in her shop had been repositioned, creating clear lanes of fire while appearing randomly placed to unsuspecting eyes. Behind each bolt of fabric on her shelves lay the tools of her true trade, guns, knives, and ammunition, all within easy reach. "Clay's men are moving into position in the hills," Smoke reported, his keen eyes picking out shapes in the pre-dawn gloom. "Got at least 6 rifles up there, maybe more." Sarah nodded, running her fingers along a piece of fine silk. "Just like threading a needle," she mused. "You have to see the path before you start." "You could have killed them all tonight," Smoke observed. "The old you would have. The old me didn't have anything worth protecting." Sarah's eyes swept across the sleeping town. "These people, they're not just marks on a ledger or faces. In a crowd. They're my customers, my neighbors. Every stitch I've sewn here means something." In the Golden Spur, Clay Thorne made his own preparations, studying his pocket watch as the minutes ticked down. "Remember," he told his men, "when the church goes up, hit the jail from the north. The seamstress will be watching Cottonwood Creek, expecting an ambush there." "And if she's not?" Miguel asked. Clay checked his gun with mechanical precision. "Then we're all dead men walking. I've seen her kind before, the ones who turn killing into an art. But she's made one mistake." He looked out at the lightning sky. "She's given herself something to lose." The first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, turning the mist into banks of pale gold. In her shop, Sarah donned her shawl, the same one she'd worn for every funeral she'd attended in Copper Creek. It was about to see more death, but this time she meant to protect life rather than take it. The coming sun would reveal whether a seamstress's careful stitching could hold together against an outlaw's determination to tear everything apart. Dawn broke over Copper Creek like a fever, painting the mist-shrouded streets in shades of bloody gold. The silence was absolute. No birdsong, no early risers heading to work, just the wet drip of rainwater from eaves and awnings. It was the kind of quiet that usually preceded a storm or a slaughter. Sarah moved through the streets like a ghost, her dark shawl making her nearly invisible in the half-light. To any watching eyes, she appeared to be heading toward Cottonwood Creek for Clay's proposed meeting. But her path took subtle detours, each pause and turn precisely calculated. From his position near the church, Jenkins watched her through his rifle scope. "She's moving east," he whispered to his companion, "just like the boss said she would." But Smoke, hidden in the shadow of a water barrel 30 feet away, saw what Jenkins missed. Sarah wasn't just walking, she was checking her preparations, each step marking the distance between carefully planned firing positions. The seamstress was measuring her battlefield one last time. The first move came exactly as Clay had planned. Fire bloomed in the livery stable, angry orange flames licking at the pre-dawn sky. Horses screamed in panic, their thundering hooves adding to the chaos as townspeople began emerging from their homes. "Fire!" The cry went up, and people rushed to form bucket lines. But Sarah noticed how the most able-bodied men seemed to stumble, spilling their water, working with deliberate inefficiency. They'd all been warned, each one personally visited by Eleanor Turner with specific instructions sewn into the lining of delivered clothes. Claythorne watched from the balcony of the Golden Spur, waiting for his sequence of events to unfold. The fire would draw attention east, then the church explosion would create chaos in the center of town. In that confusion, his men would free Billy, but something was wrong. The church remained stubbornly intact. "Miguel," Clay's voice carried an edge of panic. "Check the powder!" Miguel never made it to the church door. A single shot rang out, and he dropped with a bullet in his thigh. The sound echoed strangely in the morning mist, making it impossible to determine its origin. "Clever girl," Clay muttered, realizing his gunpowder cache had been discovered and removed. "She's been one step ahead since we arrived." Sarah's voice carried across the street, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Did you really think I wouldn't check the church, Clay? I've buried too many good people there to let you desecrate it." The livery fire was already being contained, far too quickly for a natural response. Clay watched in growing frustration as his carefully orchestrated chaos dissolved into controlled action. The townspeople moved with too much coordination, their response too organized. "The whole town's her weapon," Jenkins realized aloud. Seconds before a bullet took his rifle apart in his hands. He fell back, unharmed but disarmed, as precise shots began picking off weapons rather than people. In the jail, Billy Thorne heard the shooting start and pressed against his cell bars. "That's Clay. He's coming for me." Sheriff Reed merely smiled, continuing to clean his shotgun. "No, son. That's the sound of your brother's plans falling apart one stitch at a time." The real surprise came from the hills above town. Clay's hidden riflemen found themselves suddenly engaged by shadows that moved like smoke through the morning mist. Smoke Martinez had spent the night positioning Sarah's own allies, veterans, scouts, and hunters who owed debts to Silken Shot that could only be paid in blood or loyalty. "Call them off!" Clay shouted into the growing light. "Face me yourself!" Sarah's laugh floated through the mist. "Oh, Clay. You still think this is about proving something? This isn't a duel. It's a reckoning. Look around you. Every window holds a rifle, every alley hides a friend. I've spent 2 years sewing this town into a weapon, and you were foolish enough to test its edges." As if to emphasize her point, shots rang out from 3 different directions, disarming more of Clay's men with surgical precision. The message was clear. These weren't warning shots or lucky strikes, they were demonstrations of absolute control. The morning mist began to thin, revealing the true extent of Sarah's preparation. Clay Thorne had brought a gang to take a town, but in doing so, he'd walked into a trap 2 years in the making, where every friendly smile had been a deployment and every casual conversation had been reconnaissance. The real battle for copper. Greek was about to begin, and Clay was finally realizing he'd been outmaneuvered before he'd ever set foot in town. Clay Thorne had built his reputation on being 3 steps ahead of his opponents, but now he found himself dancing to someone else's tune. From his position in the Golden Spur, he watched his carefully laid plans dissolve like morning mist. Chakra of his best men were already disarmed, the church gambit had failed, and the fire at the livery stable was nearly extinguished. "Pull back to the saloon," he ordered, his voice carrying over the sporadic gunfire. "Defensive positions." But even as his men began their retreat, he noticed how their movement was being channeled, subtle pressure from hidden shooters, forcing them down specific streets and alleys. Sarah watched from the shadow of her shop as Clay's men consolidated their position. Her fingers traced the grip of her Colt, counting shots and distances with the same precision she used to measure inseams and hem lengths. "Smoke," she whispered, knowing the scout could hear her. "Are the back exits covered?" "Like a blanket," came the soft reply from somewhere in the shadows. "Got 4 men with repeating rifles watching the rear door, and Eleanor Turner's boy is up in the church tower with a spyglass. Nobody leaves without us knowing." In the jail, Sheriff Reed heard Billy Thorne's growing agitation as the sounds of his brother's failure reached them. "Might want to consider your options, son," Reed suggested mildly. "Your brother's just figuring out what some of us have known for 2 years. This town isn't what it seems." "Clay's got friends," Billy snarled. "Lots of them, they'll come." "Maybe," Reed agreed. "But they'll find the same welcome your brother did. Every road into Copper Creek has been watched since you arrived. Miss Sarah's been preparing for folks like you since she first set up shop." A fresh volley of gunfire erupted outside, followed by cursing as more of Clay's men found their weapons shot from their hands. Sarah's voice carried across the morning air, steady as a church bell. "That's 7 of your guns, Clay. Want to try for 8? Inside the saloon, Clay's mind raced through options, each one darker than the last. "The hostages," he muttered. "We need hostages." But even as he turned to give the order, he saw the truth. The townspeople had vanished like smoke. Every house and shop battened down tight. There was no one left to grab. "Boss," Jenkins called from his position by the window, "riders coming in from the east. Looks like the reinforcements we sent for." Clay rushed to look, hope flaring in his chest, only to die as he recognized the riders. These weren't his reinforcements. The way they moved, the spacing between horses, the controlled approach. "Carson's boys," he whispered in horror. "Not quite." Sarah's voice came from somewhere to his left. "The real Carsons are all dead, as you know. These are some other friends I've made over the years. Turns out when you spend time helping people with their mending, they're happy to help you with other things." The new riders spread out along the street with military precision, cutting off any possible escape route. Clay recognized faces among them. Gunfighters he'd crossed paths with, lawmen he'd outsmarted, scouts he'd tried to double-cross. All of them now moved to Sarah's silent commands like thread through a needle. "Last chance, Clay," Sarah called. "Out. Surrender now, and this ends with just wounded pride. Keep pushing, and we'll see if you bleed as neat as your brother." Clay Thorne had built his legend on never backing down, never showing weakness. But as he watched his men's weapons being systematically shot away, as he saw the noose of Sarah's preparation drawing tight, he realized he was facing something he'd never encountered before. Not just a better gunfighter, but a better strategist. The sun climbed higher over Copper Creek, burning away the last of the morning mist, and with it the last of Claythorne's illusions about who was really in control of this fight. Desperation has a smell, like gunpowder and fear mixed together. It filled the Golden Spur as Claythorne paced between overturned tables and broken chairs, searching for a way out of the trap he'd walked into. His remaining men watched him nervously, their confidence shattered by the systematic destruction of their weapons and plans. "There's always a thread to pull," Clay muttered, falling back on the strategic thinking that had saved him so many times before. Every pattern has a weak spot. He stopped suddenly, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Jenkins, remember, Dodge City? The Mackenzie job?" Jenkins nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes, the fire beneath the fire. "Miss Sarah's clever," Clay said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's thought of everything, except maybe what happens when her carefully laid plans all go up at once." He turned to his men, energy returning to his movements. "Start breaking up those tables. Pile everything wooden in the center. And somebody find me that barrel of lamp oil from the storage room." Outside, Sarah sensed the change in atmosphere. 2 years of reading people through their clothing choices and posture adjustments had made her sensitive to subtle shifts. "Something's wrong," she murmured to Smoke, who materialized beside her like his namesake. "They're too quiet," he agreed. "Claythorne's not a man to accept defeat without a last desperate play." In the jail, Sheriff Reed also felt the tension rising. He'd seen too many cornered outlaws not to recognize the signs. "Whatever's coming," he told his deputies, "be ready to move fast and shoot faster." The first hint of Clay's plan came as a tendril of smoke curling from the saloon's windows. Within moments, flames began to lick at the wooden walls, spreading with unnatural speed, fed by scattered lamp oil and broken furniture. "He's burning his own position," Smoke realized with grudging admiration, "forcing us to either let the whole town burn or rush in after him." Sarah watched the flames grow, her mind racing through calculations like stitches in a complex pattern. The saloon sat at a crucial intersection, its wooden construction pressed against other buildings. If it went up fully, the fire could take half the town with it. "They'll try to escape in the confusion," she said, her voice steady despite the crisis. "Clay knows we can't maintain our firing positions and fight the fire at the same time." "Right." On cue, Clay's voice rang out from the burning building. "What's it going to be, Silken Shot? Your revenge or your precious town? Can't save both." Sarah's response was not what anyone expected. She laughed, a genuine, almost delighted sound that carried over the crackling flames. "Oh, Clay," she called back, "did you really think I hadn't prepared for fire?" As if orchestrated by her words, water began cascading down the sides of the saloon from the surrounding rooftops. The night's rain hadn't just soaked the town, it had filled carefully placed barrels on every building, each one rigged with simple pulleys and ropes. "Sometimes," Sarah explained to the astonished Smoke, "the best gun work is the one you do with a hammer and saw beforehand." She raised her voice again. "You know what I learned as a seamstress, Clay? The importance of redundancy. Every important seam needs a second row of stitches." The water continued to pour, turning Clay's inferno into steam and smoke. Through the haze, Sarah caught glimpses of confusion and despair on the faces of Clay's men as they realized their last gambit had failed. "It's over, Clay," she called out, her voice carrying that deadly whisper that had made her famous. "The only question now is whether you want to end this like the legend you pretend to be, or the coward I know you are." For a long moment, only the hiss of dying flames filled the morning air. Then the saloon's front door slowly opened, and Clay Thorne stepped out into the light, his gun held loosely at his side. The final confrontation between the seamstress and the strategist was about to begin. Clay Thorne stepped into the morning light like a man walking to his own funeral. Steam rose around him from the doused flames, giving the scene an otherworldly quality. His gun hung at his side, but his trigger finger twitched with barely contained. "Intention, you know," he called out, his voice carrying across the wet street. "I've been trying to figure out why Copper Creek. Why here? Why spend 2 years playing seamstress in a nowhere town?" He took another step forward, water dripping from his hat brim. "Then I realized it's not about the town at all. It's about the crossroads." Sarah emerged from the shadows of her shop, moving with that liquid grace that had made her legendary. "Go on," she said softly, her own gun still holstered. "4 territories meet within a day's ride," Clay continued, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Every outlaw gang worth its salt has to pass through here eventually. You didn't choose a town. You chose a hunting ground." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Almost right. But you're thinking like an outlaw, Clay. Always looking for the angle, the advantage." She gestured at the town around them. "I chose a home. The fact that it lets me protect other homes from men like you is just a bonus." They were 30 paces apart now, both acutely aware of every increment of distance between them. Around them, the town held its breath. Smoke had his rifle trained on Clay from somewhere in the shadows, but everyone knew this would end with just the two of them. "You've changed," Clay observed. "The Silken Shot I heard about would have killed us all in our sleep that first night. Clean, efficient, no witnesses." His eyes narrowed. "Instead, you took your time, gave us chances to leave, used wounding shots instead of killing ones, getting soft in your old age." "Not soft," Sarah corrected, her hand moving almost imperceptibly closer to her gun. "Just learned there's more than one way to end a fight. Sometimes the thread is stronger than the blade." Clay's laugh held no humor. "Pretty words from a killer. I read the reports about the Carson family. About that business in Santa Fe. You've got more notches on your gun than my whole gang combined." "Had," Sarah said quietly. "Then I found something worth more than another notch. Found people worth protecting instead of just bodies worth counting. They were 20 paces apart now." Clay's eyes darted around, taking in the positions of Sarah's hidden allies, the wet streets that would make any fancy footwork treacherous, the morning sun that would blind anyone trying to draw facing east. "You've thought of everything," he admitted. "Every angle covered, every escape route blocked, perfect preparation." His voice hardened. "But perfection has a price. You've given yourself something to lose." "No, Clay." Sarah's voice carried that deadly whisper that had haunted so many men's final moments. "I've given myself something to fight for. That's what you never understood. The best guard isn't the one with the fastest gun. It's the one with the most to protect." Clay's fingers flexed near his holster. "Shall we test that theory?" "Last chance to surrender," Sarah offered, though her tone suggested she knew his answer. "You know better than that. Man's reputation is all he has out here." Sarah's sigh was almost sympathetic. "No, Clay. A man's reputation is what fools die for. A person's character is what they live for." Her green eyes locked onto his. "But you're right about one thing. This needs to end." The street fell silent, except for the drip of water and the soft whisper of steam. 2 legends faced each other in the morning light. The seamstress who had sewn a town into a weapon, and the outlaw who had finally met his match. The next few seconds would write the final chapter in both their stories. The morning seemed to hold its breath as Sarah and Clay faced each other. Steam rose from the wet streets like lost souls, wreathing their boots in shifting patterns. Every window, every doorway held hidden eyes watching the 2 legends prepare to write history. Clay moved first, a subtle shift of weight that would have been imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying the art of the draw. But Sarah saw it, just as she saw the tension in his shoulder that telegraphed his next move. "Your tell is in your left thumb," she said softly, making his eyes widen slightly. "It twitches 3 times before you draw. Been watching it since. You walked into my shop that first day." Clay's face hardened. "You're stalling." "No," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that deadly whisper. "I'm measuring. Like fitting a suit, every detail matters." The tension stretched like a thread pulled too tight. In the jail, Billy Thorne pressed against his cell bars, straining to see through the window. Sheriff Reed watched him with quiet amusement, knowing the young man was about to learn a harsh lesson about legends. Clay's draw was everything the stories claimed, smooth as silk, fast as a rattler's strike. His gun seemed to materialize in his hand like magic, the barrel aligning with Sarah's heart, even as the motion began. But Sarah had already moved. She didn't draw up, the traditional gunfighter's motion that Clay would have expected. Instead, she drew down and across, her movement more like threading a needle than pulling a gun. Her first shot took Clay's weapon before his finger could tighten on the trigger, sending it spinning away in a spray of blood and steel. Her second shot hit his shoulder, dropping him to one knee. The entire exchange had taken less than a heartbeat. "That's not possible," Clay gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Nobody's that fast." "Speed was never the answer," Sarah said, moving forward with measured steps, her gun unwavering. "Precision beats speed every time, just like in sewing. A careful stitch holds longer than a rushed seam." Around them, Clay's remaining men were throwing down their weapons, finally understanding the futility of their position. From hidden positions throughout the town, Sarah's allies emerged like ghosts stepping out of morning mist. Weathered men with hard eyes and well-worn guns, each one owing a debt to the seamstress who had given them a second chance. "You could have killed me," Clay realized, looking up at her with a mixture of fear and respect. Both shots were pulled. "Death is easy," Sarah replied. "Living with your choices. That's the hard part." She glanced at the jail where Billy was watching. "Your brother's young. Still time for him to learn a better way, but he needs his big brother alive to show him that way." Smoke materialized beside them, his rifle trained on Clay. "Want me to take him to join his brother?" Sarah nodded, her gun finally lowering. "Careful with the shoulder. I put a lot of work into that shot. Wouldn't want it getting infected." As Clay was led away, he turned back one last time. "The stories about you, they didn't do you justice. You're not just better with a gun. You're playing a different game entirely." "Not playing at all," Sarah corrected, "just living and making sure others get the chance to do the same." The morning sun had burned away the last of the steam, revealing a town that had faced its trial by fire and emerged stronger. Sarah looked at her shop with its blue door and neat window display, then at the people emerging from their homes, neighbors she had protected, friends she had made, a community she had chosen to serve in more ways than one. "Time to open up," she said softly to herself. "Mrs. Henderson's dress won't finish itself." The legend of Silken Shot would grow after that day, but in Copper Creek she would always be just Miss Sarah, the seamstress with the gentle hands and knowing eyes, who measured men's souls as carefully as she measured their inseams. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over Copper Creek like dust after a storm. Dr. Matthews worked steadily, tending to the wounded members of the Thorne gang with the same care he showed all his patients. Sarah had been precise with her. Shots, painful but not lethal, each one placed to heal clean if properly treated. In the jail, Clay and Billy Thorne sat in adjacent cells, their world reduced to iron bars and hard truths. Sheriff Reed watched as Sarah approached, her boots making no sound on the wooden floor. She changed back into her usual work dress, though observant eyes might notice how it was cut to allow easy access to the gun she still wore. "The territorial marshal will be here tomorrow," she told Clay, her voice gentle but firm. "Your men have already started talking. Seems they're eager to make deals." Clay nodded, his wounded shoulder professionally bandaged. "You've done this before. Not just the fighting, the reforming, giving men a chance to change. Like I said, killing's easy. Redemption's the hard part." She turned to Billy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. "You're young enough to start fresh. Your brother's smart enough to help you do it right." Outside, the town was already returning to its routine, though subtle changes were evident. People walked a little straighter, held their heads a little higher. They had faced down one of the worst gangs in the territory and emerged stronger for it. Eleanor Turner stopped by Sarah's shop, ostensibly to check on a dress alteration. "That was quite a show this morning," she said, running her fingers along a bolt of calico, "though I suspect we didn't see half of what really happened." "Best stories are the ones that stay partly hidden," Sarah replied, measuring a length of ribbon, like a well-placed seam does its work without drawing attention. Smoke appeared in the doorway, his saddlebags packed for travel. "Time for me to ride," he announced. "Got word of trouble brewing down in Texas. Figured you might want to know, just in case." Sarah smiled, but shook her head. "My traveling? Days are done, old friend. Got too many fittings scheduled." Her eyes met his with quiet understanding. "Though if you need any repairs done, you know where to find me." The scout tipped his hat, understanding her deeper meaning. Copper Creek wasn't just her cover anymore. It was her home, and she its silent guardian. Throughout the day, Sarah's other allies began to drift away, disappearing as quietly as they had arrived. Each one stopped by her shop to say goodbye, and each left with a small package, a repaired shirt, a mended coat, or sometimes just a few words of quiet wisdom. Sheriff Reed found her that evening on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Town's going to be different now," he observed. "People know who you really are." "They know what they need to know," Sarah corrected, her needle flashing in the fading light as she worked on Mrs. Henderson's dress. "That I'm here if they need me, and that Copper Creek is under protection. And the next gang that comes through," Sarah's smile held both warmth and warning, "they'll find a seamstress who gives fair prices, honest work, and second chances." Her needle paused, but only one chance. As darkness settled over the town, lamps began to glow in windows like earthbound stars. Sarah's shoplight burned steady and true, a beacon for those seeking both mending and mercy. The legend of Silken Shot would grow after that day's events, whispered in saloons across the territories, but in Copper Creek she was simply Miss Sarah, the seamstress whose careful stitches held both fabric and justice together. The town had seen her true face and chosen to keep her secret, understanding that sometimes the best protection is the kind that stays hidden in plain sight, like a well-placed stitch in the fabric of their community. 6 months after the Thorn Gang's defeat, Copper Creek had changed in subtle but significant ways. The town had grown, drawing settlers who'd heard whispers about a place where law and order prevailed through mysterious means. The railroad was considering a new spur line, and the territorial governor himself had commented on the unusual peace that seemed to reign in this particular corner of the frontier. Sarah's shop remained as busy as ever, though customers might notice new details if they knew where to look. The bullet holes in the walls had been patched with artistic care, turning battle scars into deliberate design elements. Her dress forms still contained hidden weapons, but they also displayed the latest fashions from back east. Clay and Billy Thorne had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, though Sarah's testimony about their surrender and potential for rehabilitation had saved them from longer terms. She received occasional letters, carefully monitored by prison officials, in which Clay described his efforts to guide his younger brother toward a better path. "You were right," one letter read, "about living being harder than dying. But maybe that's what makes it worth doing right." Sheriff Reed had taken to stopping by her shop each morning, ostensibly to order new shirts, but really to share information about travelers passing through. Their quiet conversations, measured in cups of tea and lengths of thread, helped keep Copper Creek's peace stitched firmly in place. "Funny thing about reputations," he mentioned one morning. "Words spread about the Thorn Gang's defeat, but nobody seems to agree on exactly what happened. Some say it was lawmen, others swear it was Apaches. Few mention a seamstress at all." Sarah smiled as she hemmed a wedding dress for a new bride. "Best stories are the ones that stay partly in shadow. Keeps people guessing, keeps them careful." The town's children still came by for their reading lessons, though now they also learned subtle things about observation and strategy, disguised as games and puzzles. Sarah taught them to read tracks in dust and intentions in posture, all while, seemingly focused on ABCs and arithmetic. Eleanor Turner had become a close friend and confidant, their shared secret creating a bond stronger than steel. She helped maintain Sarah's cover, spreading carefully chosen gossip that painted their seamstress as lucky rather than lethal, fortunate rather than fearsome. "Sometimes," Eleanor observed one afternoon watching Sarah work, "the strongest armor isn't steel or leather, it's the simple appearance of harmlessness. And sometimes," Sarah replied, her needle flashing in the sunlight, "the best way to protect something is to let people think it doesn't need protecting at all." The wanted posters for Silken Shot gradually yellowed and faded on Sheriff's office. Walls across the territories, new legends rose to take her place in campfire stories and saloon gossip. But in Copper Creek, a different kind of legend grew, one of a town that somehow stayed peaceful despite the chaos of the frontier, and of a seamstress whose measuring tape could size up more than just inseams. On quiet evenings, Sarah would often sit on her porch, mending clothes and watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no thread could match. Her guns remained clean and ready, but they shared space with scissors and pins, tools of both her trades resting together in practiced harmony. "You've sewn yourself into the very fabric of this place," Smoke observed during one of his occasional visits. "Made yourself essential to its pattern." Sarah's response summed up everything she'd learned about both violence and peace. "The strongest bindings aren't the ones that show on the surface. They're the hidden stitches, the quiet ones that hold everything together when the world tries to tear it apart." And so, the legend of Silken Shot faded into history, replaced by the quiet reality of Miss Sarah, the seamstress of Copper Creek, who measured her success not in notches on a gun, but in the peaceful rhythms of a town she had chosen to protect, one careful stitch at a time.